Why is Russia helping China with air infiltration tactics? Let's find out. It's been discovered recently that Russia is supplying China with equipment and training on aerial infiltration. And the fear is this is to help them launch a decapitation strike on Taiwan. The Chinese president has ordered the People's Liberation Army to be ready to capture Taiwan by 2027. They often move ahead of schedule. There's current high levels of cooperation between Beijing and Russia, and we're trying to find out why. I'll talk to you about the history between these two Axis forces, why they're cooperating and what their future intentions are, and what this means for Australia. So the first part is we know that China is involved in backing Russia in their war. Economically, they're supporting Russia. They're buying a lot of gas and a lot of oil they weren't able to sell due to sanctions. So China is helping on that front. And in response, Russia is accruing a huge amount of combat experience. They have been fighting for 43 months in Ukraine. They've lost up to 1 million people. When this war started, I thought, you know what, if you lose 100,000 people, that's a terrible war. Well, any amount's terrible, but for Russia, 100,000 is terrible. They've lost over 1 million soldiers, killed or wounded. To give you an idea of how bad that is, in the entire Afghan war that went for 10 years, from 1979 through to 1989, they lost 18,000 soldiers, right? So this is many orders of magnitude worse. One advantage for the Russians, they are learning at an incredible clip how to fight, I guess, a near-peer adversary. They're using American weapons and European weapons. The Russians have accrued a huge amount of combat experience. North Korea has done the same thing. They sent over 10,000 soldiers in their initial batch to go and fight against the Ukrainians. And what's happened is there's now a critical mass of combat experience in the Russian and North Korean forces that can be used to train the Chinese. The reason I'm concerned about this is I've experienced military training myself, and I know how much of a difference it makes when your instructors have high levels of combat experience. I know this because I was trained at the Australian War Academies, and I was an instructor at those same academies. I can tell you the difference between having someone that is experienced in combat is like taking someone from country football versus someone who's been in a Super Bowl or a grand final. It's a totally different ball game. You learn a lot more, your practices are better, your incentivization to improve is much higher. So I think what you're seeing is the Russians helping the Chinese develop some of these airborne capabilities, including being able to parachute or drop armored capabilities into Taiwan in the eve of an invasion. And if you think about it, this is the sort of thing that would help them bypass the rocky cliffs, the tough shorelines, the heavily defended beaches, get into the center of Taiwan, particularly to political centers, and carry out a decapitation strike quite quickly. It is a concern. I don't know how this is going to unfold. I think there's going to be very high levels of cooperation. Vladimir Putin and President Xi Jinping have been talking about an unprecedented military cooperation and a high-level partnership between the two countries for some time. Traditionally, a lot of hostility and suspicion between the two powers. However, they are at a point where they're cooperating at a really high level. And this is an interesting take that I found from a couple of guys that run RUSI analysts, Mr. Danieluk and Jack Watling wrote in their report, historically, Russia has been wary of exporting its areas of military technical advantage to China out of fears of intellectual property theft. They specialize in that, but, you know, good on them. However, Moscow increasingly sees the invasion of Taiwan and subsequent division of the global economic order into opposing spheres as a means of building leverage over Beijing by making Russia a supplier of critical raw materials and military industrial capacity. So really interesting play that I hadn't thought of, that it's in Russia's interest to have China fighting major wars because they could potentially divide the world up into opposing military spheres and have Russia becoming more economically powerful while China potentially takes a step backwards while it's fighting a war. So interesting take. Watch this space. I'll keep an eye on it. I think it's interesting that this is unfolding. I got to tell you, I talked about this just recently, Freedom's Forge. It's a really good book about the efforts the Americans made to increase defense spending and munitions production in the lead up to World War II. And it's incredible just how much work is required to get your country ready for a major conflict. And I think we're really not there yet. And I'm going to show you two charts that, to me, probably shortened the war in World War II. And it's this. Have a look at this. So what you've got there is the rate of increase, or two charts. Basically, top one is total US munition spending and also the rate of increase of munition spending. And what you see is there's a fairly substantial uptick in the lead up to Pearl Harbor, right? So before the Americans were bombed, they knew war was coming. They geared up for it. luckily, and that was about 18 months worth of production. And basically getting their resources right and refitting their factories, that ended up probably shortening the war by a long time. So luckily the US were able to do that. The allies in Australia and Europe and the US are starting to realize this, and we're slowly starting to ramp up production now. The number of arms manufacturers in Europe has almost tripled. There was an article in the Financial Times recently where they used satellite imagery to pick up a lot of the expansion. It has almost tripled. So countries are starting to gear up. I really hope it doesn't come to this, but it is wise to start stockpiling everything we need for a major conflict, because when the time comes, if we don't have it, that's going to be it. We'll be left with the resources we're able to hold in our country. Anyway, interesting take, interesting story. Subscribe. See you next time.